Welcome to the WPIAL Blitz Show. I'm Badge. We've got Ian. I think Malcolm's sitting his putting his head in there too. And our special guest is Matt
my
Morgan.
little boy's here too.
Our special guest is Matt Morgan, head coach of the Plum Mustangs. 4-0 to start this season. How great is that, Coach, after the offseason that we've had?
It's really great to hear. Typically the other way around, unfortunately, for the last few years. But, yeah, these kids really worked hard in the offseason. They deserve to be 4-0 right now.
And that's, the thing that is, amazing about, high school football nowadays is, the dedication. Like you said, the kids work hard, the communities work hard. Talk a little bit about, your high school and the community support, because it's really not just, the kids and even the coaching staff. It's a community that really supports football in Pennsylvania, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can go back to the days whenever we weren't allowed to be with our players and kids were working out on their own, quarantine. And one of the police officers in town, Danny Moriarty, he's the photographer for us as well. He noticed the boys were down there working out on their own. He got them Kona Ice one time because he just thought, like, wow, this is amazing how many kids are dedicated to this season. It may not even be a season.
Right.
So that's pretty neat. Like, you see, like, the community actually seeing the hard work the boys are, putting in when we weren't even allowed to do anything with them. And it's definitely paying off for the kids now. So you can really see the efforts they put in without us even having to be there to, coach them by their side, if you would.
Go ahead,
That's
Ian.
great. And it's really great to see Plum back on the winning track this year. For those who may be listening and not as familiar with the history of Plum won the 1983 WPIAL Quad A championship. And actually in 82 and 83, the WPIAL had so many Quad A teams that there were two separate sections and they each had a Quad A champion. Plum beat Newcastle 10-6 in the 83 championship game. Plum also had unbeaten seasons in 1986 and 1987. So there's some historical success there and currently off to a 4-0 start, looking for their first playoff appearance since 2015, which, Coach, you were the coach of that team as well. So how's this group of players handled their success this year, since it's something that this group hasn't really seen for a few years?
The one good thing about what we got going on right now is we got a good mix of older and young kids, where our older kids have played a lot of football for us. And about 3 or 4 of them started since they were freshmen, so now they're seniors. So the maturity level of those kids and understanding what it takes week in and week out to be successful, I mean, that's paying major dividends for us right now. It's like, as years past, we had struggles for leadership roles, and we got a whole group of seniors that are actually leading. Every single one of them are leading by example right now, which is phenomenal for us, and it's contagious to our sophomores and our juniors that are taking leadership roles as well. But I think that experience and maturity is what's really set us apart so far in our conference.
Speaking of your conference, you moved down from 5A to 4A this year. Was there some excitement to get back with some of your historical rivals? Because you played some teams like Highlands and Mars in the past, dating, way back to the 70s and 80s against some of those teams. But was there some excitement to move down? Was it, you kind of just barely were under the line. You're the biggest 4A program.
We're barely under the line, but if you looked at the way the schedule was actually set up, we were actually going to play more 5A teams than we were actually going to play 4A teams this year. Because I still, if you look at the history of it, last year, you had Armstrong, us, Mars, Hampton, all 5A schools last year. And our 3 non-conference games were all 5A schools. So Franklin Regional, North Hills, and Fox Chapel. So we were pretty slated to be basically a 5A team again.
Yeah.
But I liked our odds going into the season, even if it was a 10-game season. I thought our team could be really successful this year for the maturity we got and the skill level we got, and some of these new additions we had that came out for their senior years to play football, with like a couple of linemen, Colton Lohman, and a few others. It just really made a huge difference for us this year, is getting those bigger body guys in there to give the other guys a rest when they're not playing both sides of the ball, which makes a huge difference in 4A when not everybody's playing both sides of the ball. So that helps us out tremendously.
Absolutely, and it's shown on the scoreboard this year, especially defensively. Last year, you guys allowed about 39 points a game, and this year you're down to just 13 a game. So tremendous improvement on your defense. So props to you and your coaches for making a big adjustment on that side of the ball.
Yeah. Like I said, it obviously it's my coaches. I got great assistants. My defensive coordinator, Charles Morris. My offensive coordinator, Adam Santoro, has been calling great games. Scored a lot of points. But again, it's all about the effort of the kids and the fact that we got guys that don't have to go both ways the entire game. It does make a huge difference for us so far.
Yeah, that is probably an underestimated aspect of, football. I mean, that depth that you can get, especially with the big guys, where they're not going both ways. So what got those guys that, weren't, coming out for football this year, Coach?
Well, one in particular was I think he was just hounded throughout the whole off season from Max Matulski. Yeah, he was all over Colton Lum. He just said, "You're too big not to play football." All he did was play baseball, and he came out and honestly, God, the kid's an unbelievable athlete,
Mm-hmm.
and he can be really special. And somebody does snag him up for college, they're going to get somebody really good because he's so raw. But he's a kid at 6'5", 290. And then you got another kid, Josh Cummings, that came back to us after a couple year stint there. And he's probably about 6'1"-ish, and he's probably about 265, 270.
Yeah,
and then we got
good
another
stuff
kid
for a
named
4A
Jordan Majors
school.
that came back. Yeah, another kid named Jordan Majors that came back. He's about 285.
Wow.
It's you got three big boys that they don't have to play both sides of the ball. It wears on you towards the end of the game. So. And when they're fresh and you're dying because you've been playing both sides of the ball, it makes a big difference. Now, the contrast last year, we're playing Hempfield, last game of the season. I think we averaged 195 pounds across the front.
Wow.
Wow.
That's huge. Yeah. That's huge having
big difference.
That's huge having numbers. 4A especially, you can either go one way or the other. The teams that can get those, good sized players and can get those numbers really have a distinct advantage over their opponents.
Yeah, I mean, it helps out a tremendous amount. And then the fact that our skill kids are pretty darn good, too. And we got an addition of a heck of a sophomore running back doesn't hurt either. So that makes life a little easier for us.
Ian, you have a last question for Coach?
I do, yeah. So you're obviously having a historically good season. You mentioned it at the outset. It's the first time since 2015 that your team has won more than 3 games in a year. And this week you're going into a game against Hampton, who's also had more than 2 wins in a year for the first time since 2015. So what's your focus this week against Hampton, who's more or less in second place right now in the conference? So this game is essentially for the top spot.
Obviously, it's a huge game for us. It's huge games for them. It's their statement game. It's hey, we're still here. We want to be on top, and we got to stay on top. And we got to control the line of scrimmage. They got 3 really good defensive linemen, and they got a really good skill set with number 5. I think his last name's Hazelrig, and then D'Amato, the quarterback's a really good football player as well. There's a few other really good skill kids they got. But for our goal is we got to control the lines, both sides of the ball. And we hope to be successful that way.
I'll say I was really impressed with the way you guys took it to Mars a few weeks ago. That Mars had a really good running back in Teddy Ruffner, and you guys really blew him away in the second half. That was impressive.
Yeah, it was. Oh, Teddy ran. He ran for 170 yards, whatever it was. But he had 30 carries, and he earned every yard he got. It wasn't those big chunk 20, 40 yard runs. He had to earn every yard. And we forced them into passing situations, and they weren't used to that. And we capitalized on them with turnovers.
Yeah, that was.
But offensively, we were hitting on all cylinders too. So it was a really tough game for them defensively when our offense was hitting.
Yeah.
Well, it sure sounds like you've earned everything. Into this 4-0 start, Coach. A lot of hard work, a lot of community effort. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it, and best of luck the rest of the year.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys, for having me on.
Thanks a lot, Coach. Good luck this week.
All right, take care now.
All right, have a good one, guys.
All right, see you later.
Thanks.
Wow, what a great story, Ian, and we can't thank Matt Morgan enough, but just like last week, getting these coaches on whose teams are, really, you're picking out these diamonds in the rough here, these teams that are kind of surging, out from, some past problems and now surging forward with some great seasons, right?
It is, and it's great to see these programs starting to turn themselves around. And I think for a school like Plum that, like we talked about, moved down from 5A to 4A, and yes, their schedule still has a lot of teams that were in 5A last year, but a lot of those teams also moved down to 4A, and some of those teams were sort of, I'll say, the lower tier of 4A schools. So coming into this year, that Greater Allegheny Conference that had Mars and Plum and Highlands and Hampton and Armstrong and Indiana, I think only out of those schools, only Mars had made the playoffs each of the last 4 years, and a bunch of them hadn't made the playoffs at all any of the last 4 years. So basically since the state went to 6 classifications, which made this conference a really interesting conference to watch when you've got 8 teams and 7 of them have only made a handful of playoff appearances in the last 4 years. Really only Mars had consistently made the playoffs. So Plum really was in a great position, and the middle of this conference is going to get crazy. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Greater Allegheny Conference historically, when it existed back in AAA in the 4 classification era, was known for some craziness in the middle with all these teams beating each other. And it looks like that could happen again this year, though that may not have as big of an impact on the playoff races. Actually, speaking of the playoff races, that's
I was going to say, ta-da, yeah. Speaking of the playoff races.
Yes. So what we know right now is that 4 still thinking 4 classifications. What can I do? 4 6A teams are going to make the playoffs. And then in the other 5 classifications, we'll have 8 teams in the playoffs.
Wow.
What we still don't know is how those teams are going to be determined. The WPIAL is scheduled to meet this week with the steering committee and determine how, or at least come up with some at least initial idea of how teams are going to qualify for the playoffs. So I think that meeting is scheduled for Thursday of this week. So hopefully by the time we record next week, we have a better idea because we're getting down there. I mean, this is going to be week 5 now, and there's only 7 weeks to the regular season. So sooner or later, we have to figure out how these teams are going to qualify for the playoffs. And their traditional methods of playoff qualification aren't going to work this year. So they're going to have to come up with something a little bit different. One idea is to basically just treat it like the NCAA tournament, where you have the WPIAL steering committee being like the selection committee and just picking teams that make the playoffs, which could work, or it could be a disaster. So I think the real difficulty is
bring everybody's opinion into play. So
you do. The problem could be if you have a team like, say, Gateway that's missed a couple games because they had positive COVID cases. Gateway's the defending WPIAL champions in 5A. Let's say they only manage a couple more games. Let's say they finish 2-1 in the conference. What's to say that they're better or worse than a team that might finish 4-2 in the conference? It's the same winning percentage, but the other team just played more games. So it's at some point, given the environment that we're in this year, there's going to have to be some subjectivity. It's not going to be able to be all completely objective. But I think at least so far, the way the standings are starting to shake out, the better teams are starting to rise to the top at this point.
Yeah, clearly one of those teams last week, North Allegheny. In fact, they, are listed in the High School Football America, top 100. They're really having a great season, and then they beat Mount Lebanon last week.
They did. They got a statement victory 2 weeks ago that we talked a lot about over Central Catholic, who was the presumed 6A favorites. And Mount Lebanon really played them tough. Mount Lebanon played a really good defensive game. It was a low-scoring affair. It was 3-0 at halftime. North Allegheny came out in the second half and scored 2 touchdowns and got up to 14-3 and looked like they were about ready to blow it away. And then Mount Lebanon blocked a punt in the fourth quarter and scored a touchdown and went for 2 and made it. And all of a sudden it was 14-11, and North Allegheny had to put a drive together in the last few minutes of the game to seal it off. And they basically did. I mean, they punted back to Mount Lebanon with about 2 seconds remaining on the clock. So Mount Lebanon had to run one play from 90 yards away, and they tried the hook and ladder with the laterals and all that. Made it out to about midfield, but that was pretty much it. So North Allegheny, another solid victory. They're just a really well-rounded all-around team. They have a very good running game. They've got a wide receiver who's going to go to basically whatever D1 school he wants to, in Khalil Dinkins, who they use him both in the running game and the passing game, and he's an excellent defensive back. And their defense is just outstanding at all three levels. They have a really good group of linebackers, a really good defensive backfield, and some solid linemen up front. So North Allegheny is a really, really well-rounded team. Central Catholic got another victory this week. They beat Seneca Valley, who was right in playoff position as well. So Central Catholic still right in the mix. And the one other big note in 6A was that Baldwin played their first conference game. They'd missed a couple games earlier in the year with a positive COVID case, and they got beat fairly handily by Norwin, who was one of the lower end teams in 6A.
Yeah.
So I think there was some concern, like, what if Baldwin doesn't play many games? How are they going to factor into the playoff race? And then they go out and lose their first game to a team that's Norwin was next to last in 6A last year, but Butler was dead last. So I think it's fair to call them a lower tier 6A teams. So if that's where Baldwin's kind of slotting into this mix, kind of using the transitive property of, team A is better than team B is better than team C, then I don't think
connecting the
Baldwin's
dots.
really gonna connecting the dots. I mean, which with a limited number of games, you kind of have to do that at some point this year. And so I don't really think Baldwin's going to factor into the playoff race.
Pine
In
Richland
5A,
had a good win.
Pine Richland had a great win over Penn Hills. Yeah, Penn Hills has a freshman quarterback, and anytime you start a freshman at quarterback, it's kind of tough sledding the first year, except for Jeannette, whose freshman's been outstanding at quarterback. That kid's unreal. We'll get to him in a minute. But, yeah, Penn Hills has a true freshman quarterback, and they're going to be really good for years to come, because when you start a freshman, that builds a really solid base for you for years to come. But Pine Richland's just an outstanding squad. We've talked about them before. They've moved down to 5A this year after reaching the WPIAL championship game
and they're ranked in the 6A. High School Football America top 1.
Oh yeah.
Wow. So
honestly, Pine Richland could probably win 6A this year.
Yeah.
Like, they're that good. They're just loaded all over the place, and they're outstanding and very well coached. Eric Kaspowitz has done a fantastic job there, and their offense is really hard to defend. They have a dual threat quarterback in Cole Spencer, who's going to Penn on a wrestling scholarship, but he started since he was a sophomore, and when he was a sophomore, they basically installed like the RPO offense that was in vogue in the NFL at the time, and he was just able to pick it up so fast and run it. And now, like, asking high school kids to try and defend a run pass option offense is so hard to do.
It is.
NFL teams had trouble doing it. Imagine trying to have high school kids doing it. It's so hard, and he runs it so well.
Absolutely.
So they've just got the perfect mix of talent and coaching there. Another big result in 5A was Penn-Trafford really taking it to Woodland Hills this week. Woodland Hills had been off to a 3-0 start and looked really, really solid through their first 3 games, and Penn Hills just absolutely thrashed them. Or not Penn Hills, sorry. Penn-Trafford just absolutely thrashed them this week. They had a great performance from their quarterback, Ethan Carr, who threw for 2 touchdowns and ran for 2 more, and they put up over 300 yards on the ground all told. So Penn-Trafford and Gateway are definitely the top 2 teams in that conference, and we'll get to the rest of that in a minute here. I'll just run through some other quick results, and then we'll talk about where the playoff races are starting to shape up. In 4A, Plum, as we talked about, mostly in command of the Greater Allegheny Conference. They got that really, really solid victory over Highlands this week. And Chartiers Valley and Aliquippa both won big, and those 2 teams are going to face off this week with the top spot in the Parkway Conference on the line. So that's definitely going to be the game.
That's going to be a fun one.
Watching for it. It will be. It's interesting. Chartiers Valley is another one of those schools that moved down from 5A to 4A, and then Aliquippa was forced up from 3A to 4A, even though they're a 1A size school that had traditionally played up in 3A, but was forced up because the state success formula made them move up another classification.
Formula, wow.
Yeah, but they're undefeated so far, so it's hard to argue with where they are. In 3A,
Well,
North
North
Catholic,
Catholic.
Central
I mean,
Valley,
you
top
know,
two
your alma
teams, just
mater. I
absolutely
mean, one of
rolling.
my favorite
Yeah.
teams out there. All they do is win.
They're doing very well this year. Yeah, Central Valley's still definitely the team to beat. Central Valley won a Thursday night game against Quaker Valley 50-0. So since that was on Thursday, that kind of got overlooked a little bit. But North Catholic just absolutely crushed Burrell, who I thought Burrell was a team that could contend for the conference title this year, and North Catholic just beat them 66-8. I mean, North has surpassed the 50-point mark 3 out of 4 games this year, and their quarterback Joey Prentice has been absolutely fantastic for them. So just seeing my alma mater do well after how bad we were when I was there is a great thing to see.
Yeah.
It's really fun to
And
follow them.
all these classifications just look like they're just, the storylines just seem to be developing, and the same thing in 2A there too, with Beaver Falls, right?
Yeah, Beaver Falls moved down from 3A to 2A this year, and they were the presumed favorites. But as we've seen before, like with 6A, the presumed favorites don't always play it out as the season goes. But
That's why you have
Beaver
to play
Falls
the
had
game, right?
Exactly. I don't remember who said it, but one of the best quotes I ever heard was scholarship offers don't win games on Friday nights, players win games.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a stacked lineup all you want, but you got to go out there and actually perform. And Beaver Falls has absolutely done that this year. They have a combination of running backs in Josh Huff, who is going to Syracuse. So, talking about those big scholarship offers, but also Shalik Livingston, who's been absolutely fantastic with them. And then their defense, they had 2 pick sixes this week and won a rivalry game against New Brighton to reclaim the Little Brown Jug trophy that those two schools have played for since the 1950s. So that's always cool when you see teams that have had a rivalry trophy playing for something, for over a half a century, actually 70 years now. So yeah, that was really cool. And some other results in 2A, Serra Catholic is off to a 2-0 start and has put up 50 points once again. They've put up 50 in all their games. So they're a team to watch in the Allegheny Conference, although Apollo Ridge is also very good there. And basically all the other teams that I more or less expected to win, setting up some big games this week, which we'll talk about in a minute. But speaking of big results, in 1A, we talked last week about how Rochester, Olsh, and Shenango were all undefeated, and Rochester and Olsh were playing each other. And I expected a relatively close game, and Olsh had beaten Rochester 4 straight times, including in the 1A WPIAL championship game a few years ago. And Rochester just came out and thumped them. They beat them 47-21. Rashawn Reed ran for 6 touchdowns for Rochester, and Rochester is a program that had a ton of success in the 90s and 2000s, and then were very good in the 2010s, but they didn't win as many championships as they had won previously. But part of that was just because Clairton has been so good in the 2010s decade, that torch kind of passed from Rochester to Clairton as the team that was the dominant school in 1A. But Rochester has had a lot of historical success. They're a very good program. They're very well coached. And when they can run the ball and play defense, it's hard to stop them at the 1A level, especially when you have a player like Rashawn Reed, who's really, really good. And their game against Shenango in a few weeks is going to be definitely one to watch, because Shenango has a kid in Reese Watkins who scored 6 touchdowns a week ago and is also one of my favorite players to watch highlights of. Anytime he posts his huddle videos on Twitter, I'm clicking on those and watching them because they're just
I'm sure
so
a lot
much
of
fun to
coaches
watch.
are doing that too. I was really actually, I don't know, a little heartbroken that Avella went down to California.
Yeah, we had talked last week that, Avella's defense had been really good, but they hadn't seen a running game like California's yet. And that was kind of how that game played out, that California jumped out to a 28-0 lead. And Jaden Zuzak, California's running back, ran for 268 yards. And Avella tried to come back a little bit. They cut into the lead, but it just couldn't quite stop California's running game. And then they turned the ball over a few times, and that was pretty much it. But Avella's still, they're in the hunt. They're a real story to keep an eye on. And for a program like that, that has, like we talked about, only won a game or two every year for the last 5 or 6 years, they've won 3 games so far, and they're going to have a couple more opportunities to stack a few more wins. So just having a winning season for a program like that is great to see. The other great story in 1A was Fort Cherry beating Northgate. Those teams had the second and third longest losing streaks in the WPIAL. So one of them had to end. Fort Cherry's 21-game losing streak ended, and Northgate's losing streak is now 29 games. So one had to end, one had to continue, and it was Fort Cherry's streak that ended. So Northgate will still go out there looking for wins. They got a new head coach this year, and Michael Fulmore, who's a really good coach, but might take a year or so, for him to just instill a sort of new tradition in the program. They rebranded themselves, got these really cool flame stickers on the side of their helmets. So Northgate's rebuilding. They're coming back. They will be back, but it may just take some time for that program. But congratulations to Fort Cherry on breaking their streak.
It's amazing how, and we see it with schools all over the state that, when they want to like reinvigorate themselves, the first thing they do is change the helmet and change the uniform, and that's supposed to do it. I mean, it helps, but it also helps, and that. So, all right. So I'm going to try and enable screen sharing. So this is, oh gosh. So how do I do that here, Ian?
Let's see here.
Share screen.
Yeah, that'll share your screen.
Right.
So, yeah, I was gonna
hit that thing again. Hit that button. Like
okay.
I saw something where you wanted to enable the screen sharing.
Yeah. It says host is disabled, participant screen sharing.
Why is that?
I don't know. So do you have a
well,
host control?
I don't know. I think we'll have to figure it out for next week here.
Okay. Yeah,
I promise I will figure that out for next week.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I was gonna walk through all the standings that I have with the games of the week and stuff. So
advanced sharing options.
Yeah, that might work.
Who can share? All participants.
Yeah, do that.
All right. So I think who can start sharing when someone else is all participants.
There we go. I got it. We're good.
All right. Go ahead.
Yep. All right. We can just edit that part out.
All right. Maybe not. Maybe we'll just keep it in there. So.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So since we're entering the second half of the season, here's a look at the standings and matchups for the coming week. So just a quick explanation of the standings. The WPIAL standings are always organized by conference record first, and conference games are the only ones that count towards the standings. After conference record, it's head-to-head results are the next tiebreaker, followed by Gardner points, which is a strength of victory metric. So a team receives 10 Gardner points per victory for each team they defeated. So if you beat a team that has 5 wins, you get 50 Gardner points. If you beat a team that has 2 wins, you get 20 Gardner points. And those are cumulative over all your victories that you have.
Why are they called Gardner points?
The person who came up with them in like the 1920s was named Gardner. They've been around the WPIAL forever.
Somebody, and I wanted to see if you knew, so that's good stuff.
Yeah, it's been a metric that's been around the WPIAL for a long time. So it's just always been used and always been called that. And then the WPIAL tiebreaker points, which is the margin of victory metric. Basically, it's plus or minus whatever the result of the game is up to 10 points. So if you win or lose by more than 10, you only gain or lose 10 points. But if it's less than 10, then there's a gain or a loss of less than 10. And that applies to both teams. So like the winning team, if you win by 7, the winning team gets a +7, the losing team gets a -7. So that's the last tiebreaker, which comes into play a few times. So starting in 6A here, North Allegheny's at the top. I've got the matchups for this week down at the bottom. So North Allegheny is playing Norwin, who's at the bottom. Central Catholic and Mount Lebanon, right in the mix in the middle. As we said at the beginning here, only 4 of these teams are going to make the playoffs. So those teams in the middle around that Central Catholic, Seneca Valley, Cannon McMillan, Mount Lebanon range are the ones we're looking at as, the ones in the playoff hunt. North Allegheny fairly secure, especially considering they have wins over both Central Catholic and Mount Lebanon. So there's not a lot of potential, head-to-head defeats that could knock North Allegheny down to that fourth or fifth spot. I guess they'd have to fall to all the way to miss the playoffs. And especially with them playing Norwin this week, they can really solidify their position. So the two games to watch here are Central Catholic against Mount Lebanon and Seneca Valley against Cannon McMillan, kind of right in the middle of that playoff hunt. Moving down to 5A in the Allegheny 6 Conference. 5A has 3 conferences. Each conference only has 6 teams, so every game carries a lot of weight. 8 teams are going to make the playoffs here. We're not sure how they're going to qualify. So in a traditional method, it would be the top 2 teams in each conference and then 2 of the 3 third-place teams, but we're not sure how that all's going to play out this year. So just keeping an eye on things. One thing to note here is that conference record is the only one that matters for the standings. So even though like South Fayette is 2-2 and Moon is 3-1, South Fayette's ahead of them both because of the head-to-head victory. They beat Moon head-to-head basically. But the overall record does not play a factor in the tiebreakers. And you can see with the Gardner points here. So Peters Township beat South Fayette, who has 1 win. And actually this is wrong. They should have 20 here because they also beat Upper St. Clair. So sorry, that is wrong. I will have to fix that. And then with the tiebreaker points, there was a 7-point victory here. So they had a 7-point victory over Upper St. Clair. So they got the +7, and Upper St. Clair had the -7, but they had a +10 for their victory. So they're at a +3. So that's kind of an explanation on how the tiebreakers work. So it's conference record, Gardner points, or actually conference record, head-to-head wins, Gardner points, and then the WPIAL tiebreaker points. Moving on, we talked about Penn-Trafford earlier. They're scheduled to play Gateway. Gateway had some positive COVID tests that postponed or canceled actually their game against Pine Richland a few weeks ago and postponed their game against Latrobe last week, but they've gotten clearance to play again. So Gateway and Penn-Trafford are going to play at 7 p.m. on Sunday night this week. So we have a Sunday night football game in the WPIAL between 2 of the premier 5A teams. And both of these teams are absolutely contenders for not only the conference title, but also the WPIAL title, that they'll be right in the mix. Penn-Trafford played Peters Township a few weeks ago and played them to a 3-point loss. So Peters won by 3, but it was a really close game all around. And Penn-Trafford turned the ball over, I think, 7 times. So they're a really good squad. Both of these teams are really good. I'm glad they're going to get to play, and hopefully we get to see both of them in the playoffs. This is a conference where we have matchups at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. Woodland Hills and Franklin Regional are playing right in the middle, and then Latrobe and Connellsville, the bottom 2 teams, are also playing this week. In the Northeast Conference, Pine Richland, we talked about earlier, is coming off that big victory over Penn Hills. Penn Hills is taking on North Hills, who's off to a 2-0 start, but their 2 victories are against the 2 winless team in the conference. So this will be a real measuring stick game for North Hills to see just where they stack up against Penn Hills in the middle of that conference. And then Kiskey's playing Fox Chapel on the bottom end, and Shaler takes on Pine Richland in a game that Pine Richland will, for all intents and purposes, probably win by 60.
Yeah.
Moving down to 4A, Thomas Jefferson had a big victory over Bell Vernon 2 weeks ago that we talked a lot about. Their game against Uniontown got canceled last weekend. They're taking on a Laurel Highlands team who has a really exciting player in Rodney Gallagher, but has also had some defensive struggles this year. So I fully expect Thomas Jefferson to stay on top. Bell Vernon's hanging around in second place with a win over McKeesport in that loss to Thomas Jefferson. McKeesport and Trinity played a really tight game. It was 10-7 a few weeks ago. The really interesting game that involves a Big 8 conference team is Washington against Trinity. So Washington's a 2A team and Trinity's a 4A team, but they're essentially neighboring districts. That Washington is the city of Washington, Pennsylvania, and then Trinity is most of everything south of there. And you can actually see the 2 high schools from the front door of the other one. They're kind of both up on top of hills. So they're neighboring districts. They don't get to play all that often.
Yeah, Trinity's a private school?
No, Trinity's a public school.
Okay.
Yeah, it just has a name that makes it sound like a private school. But they're both public schools. They're neighboring districts in Washington County, and they're historical rivals that don't get to play very often anymore. And they both had an open date this week and voluntarily scheduled this game. This was not a game that was originally scheduled. So this was a game they voluntarily scheduled, which I absolutely applaud the 2 schools for going out and doing that and putting this rivalry game back on the slate. And Trinity's been really good this year. Washington's one of the premier 2A teams, but Trinity's been a very solid team in the middle of the Big 8 pack. The Greater Allegheny Conference, we talked about Plum taking on Hampton this week right at the top. Mars is hanging around in second place right now because they have a head-to-head victory over Hampton, but Hampton could make that a three-way tie at the top, that Plum's beaten Mars and Mars beat Hampton. So this is definitely a big game for Plum this week heading into the end of the year and trying to win that conference title. We talked about the Chartiers Valley game against Aliquippa. This is another conference in the Parkway that has, the teams at the top are playing in Char Valley and Aliquippa. The teams in the middle are playing in Montour and Blackhawk, and then the teams at the bottom in Beaver and Newcastle are also playing. But that Chartiers Valley Aliquippa game is definitely the 4A game of the week and the one to watch this. It's
got to be one of the best games in the state this week.
It's going to be good. Chartiers Valley's got a really good team this year. Kind of like Plum, that they had some kids that were really good and have been starters for a long time and just weren't having a whole lot of success in 5A, and then they moved down to 4A this year, and they're off to a really great 4-0 start. And Char Valley's beaten two solid 4A program, Montour and Blackhawk, so far this year. So that'll definitely be a good one to watch. In 3A, North Catholic's kind of running away with this conference. Freeport had a game canceled last week because of one positive COVID test, so I'm not sure how their game against East Allegheny is going to play out this week. It hasn't been announced if they're playing or not yet, but hopefully they're able to get back on the field and play. North Catholic's playing South Park in a non-conference game, which is also kind of a revenge game because South Park knocked North Catholic out of the playoffs last year.
Just look at the points for North Catholic versus everybody else. Holy cow.
Yeah. Like I said, they've scored 50 plus in 3 out of their 4 games. In the other game, I think they scored 35. So they've just been outstanding this year on offense. Yep. Yeah. They've just been blowing everyone away that they've played so far. And some programs that have been really good. I know Derry's only 1-3 this year, but Derry's traditionally been a really good program. East Allegheny was a good school. Like I said, Burrell was a team I thought had an offense that could compete, has a really good quarterback in Alex Aldridge. And North Catholic just blew the doors off of them. So North is definitely in the mix in 3A, but there's some other good programs as well, especially Central Valley, who I'll talk about in a second. Elizabeth Forward in the Interstate Conference got a big win over South Park this week. I think both of those teams are probably better than Mount Pleasant, even though Mount Pleasant's at the top of the standings right now. Mount Pleasant's gotten their 3 victories over 3 of the teams that are in the bottom half of the conference in South Allegheny, Southmoreland, and York. So, they all have to play each other still. It'll be interesting to see how those games play out, especially the Mount Pleasant South Park game is going to be one to watch in a few weeks. This week, not a whole lot of excitement in this conference. The teams on top should run away with their games against the teams in the bottom half. Yeah. And then speaking of Central Valley, their points they're right behind North Catholic. They're right around 200 points in 4 games as well. They've been just blowing the doors off everyone too. And Central Valley's defense only given up a handful of points through 4 games.
Wow, that's incredible. 15 points.
Yeah, in 2 games. Yep, they've pitched a few shutouts and been really good. But yep. And they're taking on Keystone Oaks this week, which is probably the 3A game of the week, just because it's for the top spot in the conference. Keystone Oaks edged Avonworth this past week. Keystone Oaks has a dual threat quarterback in Logan Shrub, who we talked a little bit about last week. Last season, he became the 11th player in WPIAL history to run and pass for 1,000 yards in a season. And Avonworth did an okay job of shutting him down last week, but the final was 20-13, and Logan Shrub still contributed for all 3 touchdowns between running and passing. So, you can slow the kid down, but you can't stop him. It's going to be interesting to see how Central Valley attacks him, just because of how good Central Valley is on defense.
Right.
Moving down to 2A, this conference was supposed to have 6 teams, but Summit Academy opted out of playing this whole season. They're the only WPIAL school that actually opted out of playing. So the Allegheny Conference only has 5 teams. Right now, Serra Catholic and Apollo Ridge look like the best 2 teams. Ligonier Valley, this is their first year in the WPIAL. They moved over from District 6. So it was a little hard to figure out where they would fall this season and how good they would be.
That was the thing I was going to ask you. Is that a little bit disappointing for them?
Well, I mean, they had 2 straight unbeaten regular seasons in District 6, and their only losses the last 2 years were to Richland Township in the District 6 championship game. So, I mean, they've lost as many games this year playing in the WPIAL as they had the last 2 seasons playing in District 6.
Right.
But I think they knew coming over that they wanted a tougher challenge. I think that's why they joined the WPIAL, that they knew they wanted something more challenging. And so these are, even though there's only 5 schools here, these are some really solid programs all around, really, really good football teams and good football traditions here at a lot of these schools as well. So Ligonier Valley moved over, but really kind of stepped into a buzzsaw for the conference they got landed in, just because kind of their geography, that it was tough to place them a little bit in 2A.
Right.
I was actually wondering if they would have played up in 3A, because some of those 3A schools in the interstate conference, Derry, Southmoreland, York, Mount Pleasant, Brownsville, are all geographically closer than
Right.
any of these teams that they're playing against in 2A. So we've seen that before. Actually, Apollo Ridge, the first year of the 6 classifications back in 2016, Apollo Ridge opted to play up in 3A because they would have had, I think, just one opponent within 25 miles of them if they had stayed down in 2A, but they moved up to 3A and they had 6 opponents out of 7 in their conference within 25 miles. So
Wow.
that was definitely a decision that was made for travel reasons, but it was probably a good decision, all things considered. They were competitive in the middle of that conference when they had moved up those 2 years. And they're a really good team this year that brought back a lot of really talented players. We'll probably talk more about them as the season goes on. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this conference shakes out. In 2A, there are 4 conferences. So if 8 teams make the playoffs, at least in theory, it's the top 2 from each conference, unless the WPIAL decides to do something different. In the Century Conference, probably the surprise of the season was McGuffey beating Washington in week 1. Washington's had won the last 4 or 5, I think, conference titles in a row. They had a lot of success, and McGuffey beat them 7-6 in a defensive struggle. It was kind of a sloppy game in the first game of the year, but McGuffey had kind of been that team that was always right on the cusp and couldn't get past Washington, and then finally beat them this year. So they're a really great story at the top of the conference this year, and those are definitely the best 2 teams here. Moving on, Beaver Falls, best team in 2A, without a doubt, I think. And Neshannock is off to a 3-1 start as well, hovering in second place there. They haven't played Beaver Falls yet. Beaver Falls has that big win over New Brighton that they just got. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out the rest of the year. I fully expect Beaver Falls to run away with this conference. And then finally, the game of the week in 2A is between Brentwood and Western Beaver, which are 2 really, really good programs that, because they're playing in a smaller conference, have had to play some out of conference games so far. So that's going to be definitely one to keep an eye on. Western Beaver has a co-op agreement with Lincoln Park. And if you follow basketball, you know that Lincoln Park, as a small private school, is one of the top schools in the WPIAL,
Right.
and Western Beaver gets the benefit of having their athletes on their football team. So that's been a really good co-op agreement for them. And I had a really hard time in my preseason predictions deciding between Brentwood and Western Beaver for who was going to win this conference. And I went back and forth. I ultimately picked Brentwood, but Western Beaver has all the talent in the world, and they're definitely capable of winning this game this week and winning the conference title. So that's definitely one I'll be keeping my eye on. Finally, in 1A, I mentioned the Rochester Olsh game earlier. Rochester and Shenango are now out in front of the Big 7 conference, and they should have no problems rolling through their schedule until they have to play each other later on this year. In the Eastern Conference, Springdale's a great story. Springdale had kind of been in the middle to bottom half of the conference for the last few years. They're off to a really good 4-0 start. Clairton had to postpone their game with Bishop Canavan last week because of a COVID case. So Clairton's game against Imani Christian is kind of up in the air this week as far as what's going to happen. Imani Christian snapped a 14-game losing streak, beating Riverview last week. So they're a bottom tier program in this conference. This conference has really been all about Clairton and Jeannette for a long time. So the Springdale Jeannette game is going to be a fun one to watch this weekend. Probably the 1A game of the week between Springdale and Jeannette, just to see measuring stick game for Springdale of how good they actually are. They've got 4 wins over the bottom 4 teams in the conference, but can they now compete with the top, one of the top schools, not only in the conference, but in the WPIAL altogether in Jeannette. So Jeannette lost that week 1 game to Clairton. As we have seen with Jeannette over the years, they'll lose to Clairton, but they don't lose to anyone else. Since moving down from AA to what was single A back in 2014, Jeannette is, I got to add 3 more now. Jeanette's 68-3 against all WPIAL teams, not named Clairton, and 2-8 against Clairton. So Clairton's had their number, but Jeanette's been really, really good against everybody else. And then finally, the Tri-County South. We talked about Avella a lot last week. They lost that game to California, so it looks like California and Carmichael's are kind of on a collision course for who's going to win the conference there. Avella does still have to play Carmichael's later this year, but it looks like California and Carmichael's are probably the 2 teams to beat there. So that's a quick run through of where everything is right now. Hopefully next week we'll have some more information on just what the WPIAL is going to use for their playoff qualification standards and metrics, and we'll go from there. We'll have it all broken down on steelcityblitz.com. We'll break it down here on the WPIAL Blitz show.
You know, the one thing, and it was probably the thing that was most, I don't know, I shouldn't say disturbing, but you know, it seemed like there wasn't any one of those conferences that hadn't been affected by COVID in one way, shape, or form. From 6A all the way down through, you know, conferences that have lost games canceled. You know, it's okay for the regular season. What do you do in the postseason? You know, I mean, you can't just like pick up a game so what's going to happen then? You know, and it's hard for me to imagine, and whether it's in the WPIAL or District 3 or all these teams now that are trying to come back, how's that going to happen? How's that going to work? So you get a championship game and somebody all tests positive. Well, what do? I mean, the games that are being played now, it's not like it's called being a no game. Well, there's a no game for a championship game. Do you delay it? I mean, what are you hearing about that?
Yeah. So the initial plan I had heard was basically if you couldn't play in the playoffs, it was going to be a forfeit and the other team would just move on, especially because it's not just missing one game, that you have to have 5 days of practice before your next game. So, you know, if teams have to be shut down for 10 days, you really couldn't delay it all with how the state playoff structure is set up. So you almost have to have it be a forfeit and let the other team advance, because even if you tried to delay the game, that team may not even be able to play the following week. Some of the teams we've seen miss games have missed 2 weeks of games so far. So it's one of those things where it's in the playoffs, it's basically going to have to be a forfeit, and it just is what it is. So hopefully schools are taking precautions and everyone's being safe out there. And especially as we get down close to the playoff times, that teams are taking safe measures that they'll be able to get out there and play. Because it isn't really even
necessarily the team themselves, you know?
Right.
I mean, it's you know, it's you know, somebody who's involved in the team, or you know, and look, I think everybody has kind of, for what it's worth, everybody's kind of glossed this over for the sake of getting the season going and whatever like that. But I think it becomes an enormously big deal when somebody has to forfeit a playoff game. And that's when, you know, people are going to say, you know, however they get up in arms or whatever like that. But I think it becomes an enormously big deal. So, but that's just me. So why don't we talk about some of the games you're looking at this week, you know, that are big out there?
Yeah, I kind of ran through a few of them when I was running through the schedule, but I definitely think I'll work my way back up. In 1A, I definitely think it's that Jeannette Springdale game is the game of the week, just to kind of see where Springdale fits in. Jeannette, we know, is really good in measuring stick game for Springdale. That Western Beaver Brentwood game, which is probably for all intents and purposes for the conference title, but Stowe Rocks has been really good in the the 3 games they've played, they've won pretty handily. Their one loss was a forfeit to Carleton that was not a COVID-related forfeit. It was actually a eligibility issue game. So
1-0, not 2-0, 1-0 loss.
yeah, I think it goes down as 2-0. But the interesting thing is with those WPIAL tiebreaker points, it counts as like a +10 and a -10 for the tiebreakers. So I always record it in my standings as no points exchanged in the for or against column, but as a +10 -10 for the tiebreaker points. So
Okay.
it's one of those weird things of how do you handle a forfeit. In 3A, we talked about that Keystone Oak Central Valley game. I still think Central Valley is arguably the best 3A team in the whole state. I think North Catholic is probably the
Wait a
only
minute.
team in the WPIAL
What team in
challenged them.
3A?
Central Valley.
Central Valley. Okay, I'm going to keep my
Yeah.
eye on them because we have one of those guys in my backyard, why I'm missing, who is, arguably one of the top teams. I guess next week what we ought to talk about is what teams, what teams in the WPIAL, we've got, ranked in, the Penn Live top 10, and maybe, like I said, I touched on a couple of teams that are in the High School Football America top 100. Get some into the rankings there a little bit too. Thinking out loud.
Yeah.
I think that's what this show is, thinking out loud, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. But it's fun. It's conversation. It's good, and it's good to have that conversation about high school football. I'm glad we're even able to have it in this, COVID world that we're living through. A couple months ago, it looked like we might not even get to have high school football. So it's great that we're sitting here having this conversation.
Yeah, and I guess there's new guidelines coming out on attendance as well. I mean, that seems to be changing hourly anymore.
Yeah, it's so hard to keep track of.
How these I am so in admiration of all of the, when you go to these games as we do, so much admiration for the administration, the athletic directors, the coaches, all the people that are having to basically just, like turn everything upside down to get these games on. At the end of it all, these people should get some kind of accommodation or medal for putting forth the time and effort to make these games go on as scheduled.
Oh yeah, it's been an effort for everyone involved. And like we talked about last week with Coach Cicchini from Avella, like we talked about this week with Coach Morgan from Plum, a lot of it is a community effort of being able to support, the programs and these kids, and just getting out there and playing games has been arguably this has been the hardest season for any school to put on. Games, just because of all the regulations they have to abide by, all the extra, cleaning procedures and everything else that they have to go through. And like you said, the constantly changing regulations or guidelines, I guess they are technically, from the state, the counties, all that here in Western Pennsylvania, we had the state regulations, but then we also had Allegheny County that had stricter regulations to start with, and then they relaxed those. But there was even some talk early in the year about, could out-of-county teams even come to Allegheny County and play games, or would the Allegheny County schools have to play all their games on the road, or how is that all going to happen because of the stricter gathering limits that Allegheny County had put in place? So in some places, it's so hard to keep track of, and thankfully they were able to come to agreements and play the schedule as mostly normal as it could be. And the one thing I'll say is the WPIAL has 120 teams. So considering we've only had a handful actually have to cancel games because of COVID related reasons, I know it seemed like it was one or two in every conference that had kind of missed a couple games, but for the sheer number of teams we've had, we haven't had a major outbreak of cases. And in most cases, it's only been a couple of people, whether it be a coach or two or one player or two, hasn't been massively spread. Like we haven't had a Tennessee Titans situation where it was, 6 people have it, now 10 people have it, now 15 people have it. Where with the Steelers getting their game canceled against Tennessee, like the situation with the Titans got progressively worse. And we just have not seen that at all in high school football here locally, which has been fantastic to see. So real props to all the programs that have put their guidelines in place and stuck to their protocols to be able to get these kids out on the field and be able to play.
Yeah. And look, like I said, it's not going to be a headline. People are going to gloss it over until there's a forfeiture of a playoff game in whatever district, whether it's a walkover for a district title or a walkover to get to a district championship game. And I'm not saying that it's even football. It could be in any sport.
Oh yeah, it could be volleyball.
Only at that time will it I've become, full circle with everybody that's going to make a big deal out of it. But anyway. All right, my man. Well, crazy week. Really enjoyed, the breakdown by classifications for me. See, now that's, the visual aspect of it there. See, now I'll be able to kind of use that information week on week now, for comparisons. Next week, obviously, we'll talk about some ranked teams and, hopefully you've got the WPIAL, going to come forward with exactly how these guys are, what criteria is actually going to be used to qualify, right? That's the big thing coming into next week.
Hopefully, yeah. I believe they're scheduled to meet on Thursday, so hopefully we get that news late this week.
All right. Well, anything else that you want to add before we shut this puppy down for this week?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I'd really like to thank Coach Morgan for coming on with us, and best of luck to Plum this week. Thanks to everyone who's been watching and commenting on Facebook and YouTube and on the Small Player Big Play app. And stay tuned to SteelCityBlitz.com and follow our Twitter handle at WPIAL Blitz. And just stay tuned. It's going to be an exciting close to the season. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ian, it's been a pleasure for me on how I've been able to, become more involved in everything and become more familiar with, the WPIAL. That's what I call it. But anyway, all right. Well, listen, we'll be back next week. It gets more exciting week on week. So listen, really appreciate everything you do, and I'm sure the fans do. And we'll see you next week on the WPIAL Blitz Show.